Chapter 4 is called Private Irony and Liberal Hope. And here, Rorty gives us immediately a definition of what he means by an ironist. So let's read that definition. I shall define an ironist as someone who fulfills 3 conditions. 1. She has radical and continuing doubts about the final vocabulary she currently uses, because she has been impressed by other vocabularies taken as final by people or books she has encountered. 2. She realizes that argument phrased in her present vocabulary can neither underwrite nor dissolve these doubts. 3. Insofar as she philosophizes about her situation, she does not think that her vocabulary is closer to reality than others, that it is in touch with a power not herself. So clearly the ironist is somebody who has been impressed with contingency, but as we will see later on, Rorty thinks that you can be impressed with contingency without being an ironist. What the ironist sort of adds to this is this continuing doubt. It's somebody who has radical and continuing doubts about her own final vocabulary because she knows that there are so many other options. And she realizes that she cannot, from within her own vocabulary, really argue for her own vocabulary. I mean, maybe she can do that, but it has no worth, right? She realizes that you cannot get out of irony by any type of argumentation. And finally, number 3, insofar as she philosophizes, she does not think that her vocabulary is closer to reality than others. So she also doesn't think that there's any opportunity to sort of bring in reality as a way to allay her doubts. So, an ironist would really be somebody who has radical and continuing doubts about her own final vocabulary, that is, her own terms, like her most basic evaluative terms, the kind of terms that she uses to give a meaning to her own life, to her project, to her situation. She has radical and continuing doubts about those, and she doesn't think that those radical and continuing doubts can ever be really alleviated. Right? You can't stop them either by anything internal, like some proof that you could give, or anything external, some insight that can be afforded to you by the world. What Rorty is going to do in this chapter is he is going to argue that private irony is compatible with liberal hope. Or, in other words, he's going to argue that irony is compatible with liberalism if we take care to privatize irony and see liberalism as something public. What Rorty is not going to do is he is not going to argue that irony itself is a possible stance. And I do think that something is missing there, because there is something really curious about the idea of having radical and continuing doubts in a situation where you are convinced that nothing could possibly prove you wrong or right. Right? This is the kind of situation where Wittgenstein would say, this is something that Wittgenstein says about external world skepticism, for instance. Wittgenstein says you can't really doubt the existence of an external world. Doubt only makes sense in a situation where you can investigate, right? Where there is some way to find out whether it's true or false. If you can't even imagine a successful investigation, then you can't have doubts, right? That's not a possible attitude to take. Well, maybe Wittgenstein is right or maybe Wittgenstein is wrong, but certainly you could say the same thing about what Rorty is doing here. Right? Can you really have radical doubts about your own final vocabulary if you recognize not only its pure contingency, but also, your total inability to give arguments for it or against it, or find out from any source that it's right or wrong? I don't know. I don't know whether I have grave doubts that talking about this in terms of doubt makes sense. And so I continue to have some doubts about the cogency of what Rorty calls irony. Now, again, that is not going to be Rorty's main topic here, or really his topic at all. What Rorty is interested in is taking the idea of an ironist and showing that an ironist can at the same time be a liberal. So he's going to try to combine in one vision of life private irony, like what we get from someone like Nietzsche, with liberal hope, what we get from someone like Marx or John Stuart Mill. So, how is he going to do that? Well, there's one nice thing here on page 74, I think, which I want to mention, and then I'm going to skip a whole number of pages because the first half of this chapter treads over ground that we already know pretty well. The nice thing on page 74 is that Rorty says the opposite of irony is common sense. And what I like about that is that people generally do not say about their own position that it is the opposite of common sense. But that is what Rorty is saying here, right? He says, well, I'm an ironist. I mean, Rorty is an ironist, right? So I'm an ironist, and that's the opposite of common sense. Well, why? What is common sense? Well, of course, for Rorty, common sense is, whatever is obvious within your vocabulary. To be an ironist is to doubt what is obvious in your vocabulary. To have doubts precisely about common sense. So the ironist is somebody who doesn't accept common sense. And so necessarily, one could say, the ironist is a sort of outlier in society. And Rorty is indeed going to tell us later on that there cannot be a society of ironists. That there can be a society of people who accept contingency, but there probably can't be a society full of ironists. Right? You need common sense. There needs to be something that is common sense for the ironist to be possible at all. Right? There's something parasitic, Rorty might say. I don't know whether he uses the term here, but he definitely uses the term in certain of his articles. For instance, when he tries to explain what Derrida is doing in his works, and he says, well, that's a kind of parasitic philosophy. You have the normal philosopher, people who try to prove theses, and then there's this kind of parasitic ironist philosopher who needs the normal philosopher in order to even do their thing. There's a sense in which the ironist is going to need a lot of people who are not ironists. Okay, so as I said, the first 10 pages or so of this chapter tread ground that has already been pretty well covered, I think, in the first 3 chapters. Rorty now makes a distinction between a metaphysician philosopher and an ironist philosopher. The first, of course, tries to get at something that is true, in the sense of being out there objectively, in essence. The ironist philosopher is more somebody who sees themselves as, working in a tradition, connecting thinkers and texts and ideas with each other, trying to create something new, more or less in a continuous relationship with literature. And so Rorty actually says, well, another name for this is literary criticism. It has to do with taking all these ideas that have been generated and all these texts that have been generated in the history of culture and doing new things with them, bringing them into contact, bringing them into conversation with each other in new ways. That is a way to enrich our lives, to learn about more vocabularies, learn about more final vocabularies, learn about more people, in a sense, than we could possibly meet without delving into those traditions. And so Rorty says that, our moral guide is, in a sense, this literary critic, somebody who has seen all these perspectives, who can tell stories about them, who can maybe bring into one beautiful mosaic, that is a phrase from page 89, into one beautiful mosaic, like totally different thinkers and writers, who can bring Nietzsche and Mill together, who can bring Nabokov and Orwell together, as Rorty himself will try to do later on in this book, in the last few chapters. Okay, so what I think is going where Rorty's new argumentation really starts is around page 83. So on page 83, Rorty tells that he is going to spend some time defending himself against people like Habermas. I want to defend ironism and the habit of taking literary criticism as the presiding intellectual discipline against polemics such as Habermas's. My defense turns on making a firm distinction between the private and the public. What kind of distinction is that? Well, he says, ironist theories like Hegel, Nietzsche, Derrida, and Foucault seem to me invaluable in our attempt to form a private self-image, but pretty much useless when it comes to politics. So he says Habermas is the kind of thinker who has, who tends to read everyone as a political thinker. And when he's very critical from a political perspective of people like Nietzsche and Foucault, I agree with him. But Nietzsche and Foucault still seem to me very, very useful, incredibly useful, because they are these enriching writers who really help us develop our own selves in this sort of strong poet way, this ironist way, this, always casting doubts on our own final vocabulary and trying to develop new final vocabularies. That kind of project, that's what they're useful for. Okay, so why could somebody believe, which is presumably what Habermas believes, that there is a tension, even maybe an incompatibility, between being on the one hand an ironist and being on the one hand a liberal? And for Rorty here, a liberal is somebody who thinks cruelty is bad, right? Who doesn't want to be cruel to other people, who doesn't want to humiliate other people, who wants to give other people the room to live the life that they want to lead, all those kinds of things, right? So it's a very social project having to do with, not hurting others and allowing them to pursue happiness. Well, Rorty says one of the things that happens is that people tend to believe that we need some strong metaphysical foundation, right? Something that the ironist obviously has doubts about. We need some strong metaphysical foundation as social glue in our societies, right? Our societies would collapse if we didn't all believe in some supreme moral law, or if we didn't all believe in some essence of human nature, which can be a foundation for our liberal democracy. If we do not believe in such a strong metaphysical story, then everybody is just gonna go their own way. Nobody is going to care for each other, and a total disaster will follow. And so Rorty phrases two objections. One sort of the one I've just been suggesting, and one a little bit more subtle. And this is on page 85. So near the top of page 85, Rorty talks about two main objections. The first is that as a practical matter, this glue is just not thick enough, that the predominantly metaphysical rhetoric of public life in the democracies is essential to the continuation of free institutions. So here's one way to think about that. Suppose that I say, oh, look, we've got to help people in other countries because they have basic human rights. Okay, Habermas can say that and Rorty can say that. But Habermas would say they really have human rights, right? I mean, that is sort of essential to human beings. By the way, I don't know Habermas's theory about rights. I don't know whether he would say this. But, a sort of metaphysician could say this. Really, there are these human rights. We can know that there are these human rights. That is sort of an objective truth. And that forms a basis of solidarity. Rorty would say, human rights are a useful way of talking. It's a vocabulary that we have hit upon historically. It helps us discuss some of these things. But, there's nothing inescapable about it. We could also talk in a different way. And so the number one objection would be that if you start thinking in the second way, you will stop taking human rights seriously, and you will stop taking everything seriously, and solidarity will disappear from the face of the earth. That was a really good philosophical sound, right? I'm gonna reuse that. So that's the first objection, and the second objection is that it is psychologically impossible to be a liberal ironist, to be someone for whom cruelty is the worst thing we do, and to have no metaphysical beliefs about what all human beings have in common. Okay, so Rorty tells us that he is going to summarily reject the first objection. He's going to say very little about it, and basically what he says about it is that maybe that's right. We won't really know until we've tried. But this is precisely what people said about religion, right? People have been saying for centuries that if a shared religious structure of society disappears, then society is going to collapse and nobody is going to be moral anymore, and it's all against all and it's a disaster, and that hasn't happened, right? So why would it happen with these metaphysical theories that look a lot like religious dictates? So that's what Rorty is. It's a sort of inductive or like argument by analogy, right? We got rid of a shared religion without having anything terrible happen, so we probably can get rid of a shared metaphysics without anything terrible happening. What he's much more interested is in this second objection, that it would be psychologically impossible to be a liberal ironist, that there is some tension between, on the one hand, being an ironist, somebody who redescribes things all the time, and on the other hand, being somebody for whom cruelty is a bad thing, who doesn't want to be cruel, who wishes to avoid cruelty at all costs. Let me say one more thing about the first objection before I move on to the second objection. So Rorty writes on page 86 the following. He says, the idea that liberal societies are bound together by philosophical beliefs seems to me ludicrous. What binds societies together are common vocabularies and common hopes. The vocabularies are typically parasitic on the hopes, in the sense that the principal function of the vocabularies is to tell stories about future outcomes which compensate for present sacrifices. So, what he has said a little above that is that, there's nothing terrible, there's nothing dangerous about being ironic, about real essence, objective truth, and so on and so forth. Here's what I want to say about this. There's been a lot of discussion in the past couple of years especially, but already before that, and clearly also already in the time of Rorty, but with some renewed urgency in the past 5, 6, 7 years, about objectivity and truth and human society, right? And if you think about something like all these debates concerning Donald Trump, right? One analysis is that, what we are seeing here in somebody like Donald Trump and Donald Trump supporters is they don't care about objective truth. So our shared commitment to objective truth has been destroyed, maybe by people like Rorty, and that's why people in society no longer care about objective truth, and that is why society can split into these completely different groups that have completely different beliefs, and that is terrible for democracy. Right? You as a democracy doesn't look like it's in a good shape at the moment because there are gigantic groups in society that aren't even talking to each other. They are sort of living in different worlds. They have a completely different view of what is going on in their own country, what is going on in the world. And of course, this is not just true in the USA, but elsewhere as well. It's just that the discussions around Trump have been particularly well known throughout the world. That is one analysis of what is going on, but this would be Rorty's analysis. Rorty would say, look, why do these people have completely different beliefs? That has nothing to do with, any sort of loss of metaphysical faith in objective truth. Right? It's not that, all these Donald Trump supporters have been reading Rorty or Derrida or something like that and say, there's no objective truth. In fact, many of them are completely convinced that what they believe is the objective truth. Right? What Rorty would say, I think, is that what has happened in US society is that there are no common vocabularies and common hopes. These people think, like there are groups in society that think in very different ways about what the future should be like, about how you should describe the United States of America, how we should describe ourselves. And it is this difference in vocabularies and hopes, this lack of common vocabularies and common hopes, that leads to the epistemological situation where people have completely different beliefs and where they interpret what happens in completely different ways and where they are maybe easily persuaded by people who speak to their hopes and, who paint people with different hopes as the enemy and therefore the speakers of falsehoods. And so for Rorty, it wouldn't be like a lack of objective truth that is at the bottom of the problem. It's a lack of shared hopes and shared stories that is at the bottom of the problem. And it would seem to me that Rorty's analysis could well be right. Right? That it might be a much more acute analysis than anything that has been said under the moniker of post-truth or stuff like that. Okay. I'm not saying that I've proved that, but I do want to put that on the table as one consideration here. So, where do we end up? We end up, and now we are at page 87, where Rorty tells us that in the ideal liberal society, the intellectuals would be ironists, but the non-intellectuals would not. The latter would, however, be commonsensically nominalist and historicist. So here he tells us that he can't imagine a society composed of ironists. It's only some, some intellectuals like Rorty and maybe you and me. You are at video 8 of a Rorty course. You must be an intellectual and maybe an ironist. Those are the kinds of people who can have these grave doubts about their own vocabularies, who are searching out in books all these other vocabularies. That's not something that the common man or woman on the street necessarily does. They have common sense. But that common sense is historicist. Right? They don't talk about essences. They don't talk about like any of these metaphysical these metaphysical claims that are supposed to form the glue of society, according to the metaphysician. So that's just a note about what a liberal society looks like. Now let's look at that second objection, right? The objection that somehow there would be a tension between being an ironist and being a liberal. Well, where does the idea that there is a tension come from? This Rorty explains on page 89. He says, well, there is something right about the suspicion which ironism arouses. Ironism, as I have defined it, results from awareness of the power of redescription. But most people do not want to be redescribed. They want to be taken on their own terms, taken seriously just as they are and just as they talk. The ironist tells them that the language they speak is up for grabs by her and her kind, the ironists. There is something potentially very cruel about that claim, for the best way to cause people long-lasting pain is to humiliate them by making the things that seemed most important to them look futile, obsolete, and powerless. So there seems to be a cruelty inherent in ironism. If I don't take you seriously in your vocabulary, wow, that can be really humiliating. If I don't know, maybe you have a very strong religious faith. And I have a story about how your religious faith is, only a way to cope with certain psychological pressures. That's not necessarily my story about religious faith, but, let's assume it is for a moment. That is kind of humiliating, right? That doesn't make you feel good if I tell that story. Maybe you're not convinced by it. Maybe you think maybe you have your own way of redescribing me as a sinner who is possessed by the devil or something like that. But we are not on a good start. We are sort of hurting each other with those descriptions. So redescription often humiliates, Rorty tells us on page 90. But then he goes on to say that actually there's no difference here between ironism and metaphysics. If you are a metaphysician and you have some way of describing the world that doesn't fit my own way of describing the world, the same thing happens. This already happened in my example just now. If you are a traditional religious metaphysician, let's say that you say that, we've all been made by God and our purpose is to serve God and do what God commands, and otherwise you go to hell. And you say to me, well, Victor Gijsbers, you are not doing what God commands and you are a complete failure as a human being and you will go to hell. That's not a nice description. And if you have the power to impose that description on me, then it's going to be very humiliating for me. Right? So the fact that you, as a sort of traditional metaphysician, and I, as an ironist, if I were an ironist, that our redescriptions can hurt the other, that's true. But that has to do with redescription and not with irony or metaphysics. Right? So it's the redescribing, it's the imposing a description on somebody who has a different description of themselves. That is what might hurt. Okay, but, says Rorty, there is something that the metaphysician generally supposes themselves to be able to do that the ironist isn't. Because the metaphysician thinks, this is the bottom of page 90, that there is a connection between redescription and power, and that the right redescription can make us free. The ironist offers no similar assurance. So I conclude that what the ironist is being blamed for is not an inclination to humiliate, but an inability to empower. From the point of view of the metaphysician, giving somebody the true vocabulary is setting them free. If you are that religious thinker, that traditional religious thinker that I just posited, then you think that telling me that I'm a sinner and that I will go to hell if I don't repent, that's what's setting me free, because that allows me to take over your description of myself, to repent, to convert, to become free and saved and, fit in the right place. Become what I ought to be. And of course that's not the way that the ironist thinks. If the ironist comes up with a redescription, that's not the right description that will allow me to become the one thing that I ought to be. It's just another redescription, put there for whatever purposes. So from the point of view of the metaphysician, something seems to be lacking in the ironist. But of course, from the point of view of the ironist, the promise of the metaphysician is an empty promise. Right? There is no freedom, there is no power in that particular redescription, which means that all of us have to accept it. That is only a power grab. That is only an attempt to put your point of view onto everyone else. Okay, so here the ironist in many ways can just dismiss the metaphysician's idea. There's nothing missing in ironism, because what metaphysics seemed to offer is actually violence. Right? To come forward, this is not, I think, the term that Rorty uses here, but others have used it, like somebody like Gianni Fatimo, for instance, and probably lots of other people, especially in the continental tradition. Metaphysics is violence. If I think I have the essential description of human nature, then I am telling you that if you don't accept my description, if you don't copy my way of talking, you're not really yourself. You're not being a successful human being. I am imposing something on you. That would be metaphysics as violence, and that is clearly what Rorty is rejecting here. So what does the ironist do? The ironist, who is also a liberal, who doesn't want to hurt people. So I want to redescribe, but I don't want to hurt people. What do I do? Well, the solution, Rorty says, is simple. And this is at the bottom of page 91. It is to distinguish between redescription for private and for public purposes. And so the idea would be that all my weird Nietzschean redescriptions, they're mine. I mean, what do you have to do with them? Right? If I redescribe you in some private way, private for me, I mean, you don't have to accept it. You don't even have to know about it. If I can take my irony into the private, I'm not hurting anyone with it. And for Rorty, that is where a lot of this, strong poet stuff finds its true home, if that's I shouldn't use the word true maybe, but that's why it's most powerful. But we want to develop ourselves, and what you think about that is in a sense irrelevant, and in fact you don't even really have to know about it. So what is human solidarity then? I mean, if human solidarity does not consist in this metaphysical state of grasping the true nature of humanity, what is solidarity based on? And I think Rorty has some beautiful things to say about that here at the end of the chapter. At the end of the future, that would be, I don't know, pretty scary. At the end of the chapter. So here's page 92 at the bottom. Human solidarity is not a matter of sharing a common truth or a common goal, but of sharing a common selfish hope. The hope that one's world, the little things around which one has woven into one's final vocabulary. Okay, it's Rorty's mistake. The hope that one's world, the little things around which one has woven one's final vocabulary, will not be destroyed. Right? We all want our view of our life to sort of remain intact, to not be crushed by other people. Well, so how do we get into solidarity? Well, we've got to become aware of what is important for other people. We've got to become aware of other people. We've got to try and understand them on their own terms, to see how we could hurt them and what we can do to not hurt them or even help them. And so Rorty says, and I think this is really beautiful, at the bottom of page 94, solidarity has to be constructed out of little pieces. Right? Rather than found already waiting in the form of an language which all of us recognize when we hear it. Solidarity is not some abstract metaphysical thing where, yeah, okay, I see it, now I have solidarity with everyone. It has to be constructed out of little pieces. We've got to become aware of other people. And for Rorty, what is going to help us most with that is literature, and especially novels. And we'll hear more about that later on.